Ladies and gentlemen, there's a moment after you finally walk away, after the texts are left unread, the calls go unanswered, and the doors quietly close behind you where everything feels impossibly quiet. That silence can feel unnatural at first. It's not the kind of peace that feels like a spa day or a slow morning with coffee and a good book. It's a silence that hums with everything you've been carrying. It's thick. It's heavy. It's honest. You might be tempted to fill that silence, call a friend, scroll for hours, go back even to the drama and confusion, because it was at least something. But that would be a mistake, because that silence, that uncomfortable stillness, it isn't empty, it's sacred. And if you can just stay there for a little while, if you can resist the urge to run, you'll hear the truth start to echo in ways it never could when you were in the noise. Silence is where all the pieces start to settle. The stories you told yourself, the ones you were fed, the narratives you clung to out of survival, they start to fall apart, not out of anger or revenge, but because they were never whole to begin with. You begin to realize just how loud the confusion was, how much of your energy went into trying to decipher mixed signals, to defend yourself against unspoken accusations, to twist yourself into someone more lovable, more agreeable, more tolerable. You begin to notice how much of your identity was shaped by trying to avoid their disapproval or dodge emotional landmines. And now, in this new silence, there is space. Space for your voice to come back. Space to say, that didn't feel right, without being interrupted. Space to finally ask, why did I stay so long? Not as a weapon against yourself, but as a doorway into your own truth. This is where courage starts to grow, not in the dramatic moments of confrontation, but in the quiet hours where you begin to trust your own perception again. When you no longer need anyone to validate what happened for it to be real. When you stop performing strength and start practicing it. When you realize that your healing doesn't need to be understood by the person who hurt you in order to matter. The silence teaches you that truth doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it comes in fragments, moments you replay in your mind that you used to excuse away. Glimpses of your old self that you hardly recognize now. And while part of you might still crave the chaos just to feel something, the wiser part of you, the part that chose distance, is finally learning to feel safe in stillness. You start to see that what felt like love wasn't actually love, it was dependency. It was control. It was survival. And love doesn't make you shrink. Love doesn't punish you for being tired or human or honest. Love doesn't confuse your worth with your usefulness. You know that now, or at least you're beginning to. And this knowing doesn't arrive with trumpets or applause. It arrives in silence, in your quiet refusal to go back, in your choice to let the phone ring and not answer, in the way you sit with your own discomfort instead of trying to escape it, in the way you breathe deeper, even if your chest is still tight. You learn that silence is where your nervous system recalibrates. It's where your dignity starts to root again, where your boundaries become more than words, they become non-negotiable truths. You begin to realize that you were never asking for too much. You, were asking the wrong person. And now, without the need to be seen through someone else's eyes, you start to see yourself more clearly. There is grief in this silence, too, not just for what happened, but for what didn't. For the moments you should have been protected, held loved, for the emotional safety that never came, for the parts of yourself you abandoned just to maintain peace with someone who wasn't offering it. Grief is loud, even in silence, but it's also a path to wholeness. It's not weakness. It's what softens the hard edges you had to build just to make it through. This silence becomes your sanctuary, a place where no one is rewriting your reality. No one is spinning your sadness into guilt. No one is taking your vulnerability and using it as ammunition. Here you begin to take your power back, not through defiance, but through quiet truth. You begin to realize that you never had to shout to be heard, you just had to stop standing in places where your voice was never meant to matter. Silence isn't absence, it's presence. It's the sound of your own soul returning home. It's the sacred pause where you remember who you were before you were told who to be. And it's the most radical, life-giving sound you'll ever hear. Boundaries are not walls. They are not punishments. They are not dramatic ultimatums. They are, at their core, deeply courageous acts of self-respect. They say, this is where I end and you begin. They define what you will allow and what you will no longer carry. And most importantly, they announce to the world, and more critically, to yourself, that you are worthy of peace, safety, and dignity. When you finally draw a boundary, especially after a long season of being in a relationship that confused, manipulated or wore down your sense of self, it doesn't feel like empowerment at first. It often feels terrifying. You're not used to prioritizing your own needs without guilt. You've been conditioned, maybe for years, to think that your discomfort was something to tolerate, that your emotional exhaustion was just the cost of staying connected, that speaking up for yourself would create more harm than keeping quiet. So when you finally say no more, or when you hit that point where something inside you quietly snaps, not in anger, but in exhaustion, it feels unfamiliar, maybe even wrong. But it's not wrong. It's the moment you begin to reclaim your voice. A boundary isn't just a line you draw between yourself and another person. It's a mirror that reflects back your self-worth. When you create a boundary, you're telling yourself, I matter, my needs matter, my peace matters. And that kind of declaration doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need a big speech. It happens when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. When you stop participating in conversations that only lead to emotional chaos. When you let the silence stand rather than chasing clarity from someone who has no intention of giving it. Boundaries speak volumes without needing to raise their voice. The truth is, people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will rarely celebrate when you start building them. They might call you cold, selfish, dramatic. They might act confused as if they don't understand why you're pulling away. But deep down, they do understand. They understand that something inside you has shifted, that you're no longer willing to negotiate your self-respect, that you're choosing to leave the tug of war instead of pulling harder. That's threatening not because you've hurt them, but because they can no longer shape your reality. They can no longer use guilt or fear or obligation to control the narrative. And that's where the silent power of boundaries begins to rise. You don't need to fight to be understood anymore. You don't need to convince someone of your pain. You're no longer performing strength while your heart is breaking. The moment you uphold a boundary, even if your voice shakes or your hands tremble, you are choosing yourself in a way that goes far beyond self-care. You are writing a new internal script. One that says, I am no longer available for relationships that drain me, confuse me, or dishonor me. And here's the hard part, boundaries often come with loss. Sometimes they cost you relationships. But the truth is, those were relationships that required your silence to stay intact. They needed you to bend, to shrink, to doubt yourself. And when you stop doing that, you start to see what was real and what was dependent on your self-abandonment. That's grief. That's truth. And that's growth. There will be moments when you'll want to go back, not because the boundary was wrong, but because it's uncomfortable. Healing is not linear. Sometimes your nervous system will crave the chaos simply because it was familiar. Sometimes you'll miss the highs that came before the inevitable lows. That doesn't mean you should cross the boundary you worked so hard to establish. It just means you're human. That part of you that learned to survive by people-pleasing or avoiding conflict or making yourself small, it's not bad. It just learned what it had to, but now you're unlearning. And that takes time, compassion, and deep self-awareness. Every time you honor a boundary, you reinforce the belief that you are worthy of being treated with kindness and clarity. And that belief grows. It starts showing up in other areas of your life. You stop over-explaining at work. You say no without offering a 10-point justification. You walk away from conversations that feel like emotional warfare. You take longer to reply to texts that trigger old patterns. You give yourself permission to rest, to not be on all the time, to protect your energy. You start choosing your peace over your performance. What people don't tell you is that boundaries don't just protect you, they introduce you to a version of yourself you may have forgotten. A version that isn't constantly second-guessing or shape-shifting to keep the peace. A version that can sit in discomfort without needing to fix or prove. A version that is rooted, grounded, and no longer swayed by someone else's inability to love well. Boundaries are not the end of love. They are the beginning of real love, of honest connection, mutual respect, and emotional safety. When you set them, you're not closing your heart. You're opening it to healthier ways of being, to relationships that don't require pain as proof, to the quiet, steady knowing that you are enough, even when you say no. Especially when you say no, that is the loudest declaration of worth there is. Control doesn't thrive in spaces where accountability is alive and breathing, and that truth becomes stunningly clear the moment you remove yourself from relationships built on manipulation, blame shifting, and emotional distortion. For so long, you might have felt like you were walking on eggshells, monitoring your tone, rehearsing your words, calculating every response, just to prevent another emotional storm. Control had a presence you could feel in your body, the tightening in your chest before speaking up, the confusion after every argument, the self-doubt that crept in even when you were sure of your own feelings. But the moment you cut contact, the moment you step out of that dynamic and begin to anchor yourself in truth, you start to see what was always at play. Control only works where responsibility is avoided. Accountability is the quiet force that dismantles manipulation. It doesn't yell. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists in the refusal to carry what isn't yours. When you begin to take responsibility for your own healing, your own triggers, your own truth, you create a shift that control can't coexist with. And what makes that shift so powerful is that it doesn't require anyone else's participation. You stop arguing. You stop begging to be understood. You stop offering explanations to people who never listen. You simply say, no more, and mean it. You leave, you grow, you hold yourself accountable for where you ignored your gut, where you accepted crumbs, where you doubted your worth, and in doing so, you stop making space for those who won't do the same. Control needs chaos to survive. It feeds on your uncertainty, your guilt, your desire to make things work at any cost. But when you become rooted in self-awareness and accountability, you no longer play the role that control relies on. You stop absorbing blame that isn't yours. You stop being the emotional scapegoat. You start to recognize gaslighting when it happens, and more importantly, you stop trying to argue with it. Control loses its grip when it can no longer confuse you. That's the power of clarity. That's the power of taking responsibility for your healing, not for someone else's damage. In relationships that revolve around control, blame is currency. It's always someone else's fault. There's always a reason outside themselves for the harm they cause. The story is rewritten 1,000 different ways to avoid looking inward. And when you no longer accept that narrative, when you stop being part of that loop, something very fragile begins to break down. Control isn't sustainable without someone else's participation. And once you step out of that dance, the silence that follows speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to prove anything. The boundary you've set, the space you've created, the absence of your compliance that does all the speaking for you. That's what real accountability looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about owning your truth so completely that manipulation can't find a way back in. It's about recognizing that someone else's refusal to grow isn't yours to fix, that you're not responsible for their healing, their pain, or their inability to face themselves. This isn't about superiority. It's not about being better than someone. It's about being honest with yourself. Control thrives in relationships where people are afraid to be honest, afraid of rocking the boat, of being abandoned, of being painted as the villain. But when you choose accountability, you choose truth, even if it's painful. You choose to see the patterns, not excuse them. You choose to stop betraying yourself just to maintain connection. And that's when everything begins to shift. It's disorienting at first. When you've been gaslit or emotionally manipulated for a long time, clarity can feel like a betrayal. You question yourself. You wonder if you're overreacting. You replay old conversations trying to find the moment where everything started to go wrong. But the moment you start to see clearly, the moment you realize that no healthy relationship requires this much confusion, you also begin to feel something else, relief. The weight you've been carrying starts to lift because you're no longer carrying someone else's emotional responsibility. Accountability gives you your power back. You stop trying to control how others see you. You stop needing someone to validate your experience. You learn to sit with your truth, even when it's not shared by anyone else. And that's where control withers, because it can't exist in an environment where people are willing to face the hard truths, have the hard conversations, and own their part. Control doesn't survive where people are no longer afraid of being alone, misunderstood, or disliked for doing what's right for them. The most radical thing you can do is take full ownership of your life. Not in a way that excuses others, but in a way that liberates you. You don't heal by controlling the narrative. You heal by refusing to be part of the ones that hurt you. You don't reclaim your voice by shouting louder. You reclaim it by walking away from the places where you had to scream just to be heard. You don't need to prove the harm that was done. You just need to stop living inside it. And when you do that, when you begin to embody accountability in your everyday life, you stop attracting chaos. You stop needing to fix or rescue. You start living in a way that says, I'm not afraid of my truth and I'm not afraid of yours either. That's what makes control powerless, because it can only exist in places where people are too afraid to look in the mirror. But when you're brave enough to do just that, and you surround yourself with people who do the same, You create a life where truth is safe, love is mutual, and control has no home. Disconnection is often misunderstood as indifference, as if walking away means you've stopped caring or that your absence will go unnoticed. But the truth is, disconnection has a way of echoing in places where words never reached. It isn't the absence of emotion, it's the presence of a new kind of clarity. When you choose to disconnect, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of self-preservation, it initiates a process that goes far deeper than the surface. It triggers reflection, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, even in those who may never acknowledge it. When you were in the relationship, the dynamic was often about survival. You were constantly negotiating your boundaries, questioning your feelings, trying to keep the peace at the expense of your peace. You were in a cycle of giving and explaining, of managing reactions and softening your truth so it wouldn't be turned against you. And for a long time, you might have believed that unless there was a dramatic ending or a final conversation full of mutual understanding, the relationship would never truly close. You thought that if you didn't get the apology or the acknowledgement, the disconnection wouldn't count. But something shifts when you finally choose to leave without begging to be heard. When you no longer hand over your emotional experience to someone else for validation. When you stop chasing closure and begin offering it to yourself. That's when disconnection becomes powerful, not because of what it says to them, but because of what it says to you. And in the silence that follows, even if no one ever admits it, something starts to stir. The absence you leave behind is not neutral. It interrupts the cycle. It removes the audience. It creates a void where justification and blame used to live. And that void has a way of forcing people to sit with what they were never willing to face while you were still there. Reflection doesn't always come with remorse. It doesn't always come with change. And more often than not, it doesn't come with acknowledgement. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening. Sometimes the most honest realizations arrive in solitude long after the opportunity for reconciliation has passed. It's in the absence of your presence that people are left to confront the weight of their own patterns. When there's no one left to blame, no one left to fix, no one left to carry the emotional load, the silence gets loud. Loud enough to stir something real, something uncomfortable, something telling. This isn't about revenge. It's not about waiting for someone to finally realize your worth. It's about understanding that your decision to walk away wasn't just an ending, it was a mirror that reflects what happens when care is taken for granted, when kindness is met with manipulation, when communication is twisted into conflict, and you may never get the satisfaction of hearing, "You were right," or "I'm sorry for how I treated you." But the absence of that acknowledgement doesn't mean it wasn't real. It doesn't erase the impact of your boundary. It doesn't weaken the truth of your experience. Disconnection is often the only language left when all other efforts have been exhausted, when words have been weaponized, when vulnerability has been punished, when showing up with your heart open has only led to deeper wounds. In that space, stepping back becomes an act of self-respect, not silence. It becomes a statement, "I will no longer participate in dynamics that ask me to betray myself." That kind of clarity is jarring, especially to someone who is used to your emotional availability, especially to someone who relied on your doubt to avoid their own. And while they may never say it, they feel it. People feel the absence of what was once constant, the energy that no longer arrives to soften the edges, the attention that no longer shows up to manage their mood, the love that is no longer available without accountability. They feel it, not because you've made a grand declaration, but because something they were once tethered to is no longer within reach. And that shift has a way of awakening awareness, even if it's buried beneath pride, denial, or defensiveness. You don't need their reflection to validate your healing. The process of walking away, of grieving the connection, of reclaiming your sense of self, that's where your power lies. And in that process, you might be surprised to find your own reflection surfacing. You start to see where you ignored red flags, where you gave more than you received, where you tried to explain yourself to someone who was committed to misunderstanding you. And instead of blaming yourself, you meet those truths with compassion. You realize that your willingness to stay wasn't weakness, it was hope. And your willingness to leave wasn't coldness, it was wisdom. It's easy to believe that without acknowledgement, healing is incomplete, that without a shared narrative, your experience doesn't count. But that belief only keeps you tethered to someone else's willingness or refusal to face the truth. You don't need anyone to validate what you lived through in order for it to matter. The absence of their recognition doesn't diminish the strength it took to walk away. It doesn't erase the courage it took to choose yourself, even when it was lonely, even when it was misunderstood. Disconnection isn't about cutting someone off to punish them. It's about cutting off the supply of your emotional labor to preserve your peace. And whether or not it's ever acknowledged, it always creates a ripple, a shift, a pause that invites reflection, whether or not it's accepted. You don't always get to witness the impact of your absence, but you don't need to, because your healing was never supposed to be dependent on someone else's awakening. It was always meant to come from your own. Your healing, whether quiet or visible, sends out a ripple that moves far beyond what you can measure, even if no one ever acknowledges it, even if the ones who hurt you never change, even if the people closest to you don't understand what it took to break those generational cycles, unlearn the dysfunction, and stitch yourself back together in silence. Healing isn't just about what changes inside you, it's about what your healing shifts in the world around you, even if you never get to witness the full impact. When you begin to heal, especially after being in a dynamic where your pain was minimized, dismissed, or manipulated, the process often feels invisible. You're making choices behind closed doors, choosing not to respond to chaos, choosing to rest instead of perform, choosing to speak your truth even when your voice shakes. Those small choices feel quiet. They feel personal. They feel like they exist in the vacuum of your own experience. But every time you choose a different response, every time you interrupt a pattern that once felt inevitable, you're creating space for something new. And that space has impact. Healing doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It moves slowly beneath the surface. It looks like you pausing before reacting. You catching yourself before repeating the same old story. You comforting the parts of you that used to reach for people who couldn't love you well. It's subtle. It's repetitive. And it's powerful because the more you honor your truth, the more your energy shifts. The more your presence changes. You become less reactive and more intentional, less consumed by other people's chaos and more rooted in your own peace. And that shift doesn't just benefit you, it affects how others experience you. You may not see it right away, but someone is watching the way you speak to yourself now. Someone is noticing the way you set boundaries without anger, the way you apologize when you're wrong without falling into shame, the way you ask for space without shutting people out. Someone is being shown just by your being that there is another way to move through pain, another way to handle conflict, another way to live in truth without abandoning love. And even if they never tell you they're being changed by your example, it's easy to underestimate this kind of influence because it's not loud or public. It's not about preaching or convincing anyone to heal like you. It's about embodying the change in a way that makes healing feel safe, real, and possible. That's the ripple. Your child watching you regulate your emotions instead of yelling. Your friend realizing they can say no without guilt after hearing you do it without apologizing. Your partner learning that communication doesn't have to feel like combat. These shifts matter. They build a new emotional culture, one that may not have existed in your family, your community, or your past relationships. Even in situations where your healing creates distance, where your growth leads to disconnection rather than closeness, it's still a ripple. Because when you leave a dynamic that required your self-abandonment to function, you send a silent but powerful message. This is what it looks like to honor yourself. That message might be resisted, mocked, or ignored at first, but it lingers. It challenges people to confront their own choices, to reflect on their own patterns, and sometimes in moments you'll never see, that reflection leads to their own healing journey. You may never know how your courage inspired someone else to start therapy, how your boundaries helped someone else realize they needed their own, how your decision to walk away gave someone else permission to do the same. Your healing might never be acknowledged directly, but that doesn't mean it didn't matter. You're not doing this work in a vacuum. You're shifting the energetic blueprint of what's possible in your relationships, in your lineage, in the quiet spaces you once felt powerless in. That matters, that counts, that ripples, even if you're still in the middle of the hard part. Even if you're grieving the loss of people you thought would grow with you. Even if you're not entirely sure where this path is leading. You are not healing in vain. You are planting seeds of emotional safety, of honesty, of accountability, and those seeds grow, even if you never get to sit under the shade of their trees. It's human to want recognition, to want evidence that all this internal work is doing something. But healing asks you to trust in what you cannot see, to believe in the quiet revolution you're creating just by showing up differently, just by loving more honestly, just by breaking patterns you were never meant to carry. You might not get the applause. You might not get the reconciliation, but what you do get is your own wholeness, your own peace, And the quiet knowing that somewhere someone's life will be better, not because you saved them, but because you saved yourself. Healing is legacy work. It's the kind of change that outlives your presence. It echoes in the lives you touch, in the stories you rewrite, in the trauma you refuse to pass down. That is sacred. That is enough. And even if no one ever names it, your healing leaves a mark, not just on your life, but on the world.